Hello everyone, I'm Anjali. Thank you for providing this platform to enable me to share my work and thoughts. My talk today is titled Wandering Around in Search of Places that Hold Moments that Reveal and Passages that Connect. As someone who practices landscape architecture, one of the primary tasks I'm engaged in is of making gardens and design landscapes. And at the start of every project is the question, what should this garden do? Indeed, what should gardens do? From amongst the many responses that I have come across, some helped clarify this question more than others. One of them is the sentence by Dan Pearson. This is where gardens play their part, for they allow us to access landscape and nature and to a degree feel part of it. End of quote. I think that they should allow us to dwell and probably should create a setting that allows us to look around. But then this, to my mind, implies an awareness of both the larger landscape, environment, nature, as well as a place within it to inhabit. So apart from the making of gardens, one of the things that preoccupy the mind many times is the larger landscape that we are within, and to be able to make sense of it in a way that is more than just a sum of its parts of geology, topography and vegetation. Sometimes, and usually, while just wandering around, you find a place or a moment that opens a window. It tells you what the place is like or would have been like inherently in its uncultivated state. It reveals what is at home here. It tells you all this and more through a very visceral and sensorial experience. Simultaneously, it evokes both memory and imagination. However, as landscape architects, we, in the words of Dennis Cosgrove, start of quote, inhabit both the unalienated insider's apprehension of the land, of nature, and the sense of place, together with a more critical, socially conscious, outsider's perspective, what he calls the landscape way of seeing, end of quote. Thus, there is a search for moments that reveal the nature of place in all its specificities. While this seems to be straightforward, such instances are perhaps not that many. But the moment you are face to face with one such place, usually the recognition is immediate, with a sense that everything here belongs together in this particular location and for a long duration. It completely engages your senses and your body. It reveals its stories of its sights, sounds and smells, the many creatures that live in it, and also how you can inhabit it. These places are not only in the wild or the wilderness, but also ones that have seen human agency in ways that have somehow tapped into the rhythms of the place and responded to them in many ways. And the quest for finding such places and moments is literal and physical. Apart from the accidental discoveries, one of the more constructive ways in which it has happened is through the landscape foundation studio that I have been engaged with for the last couple of years. For this studio, we have been delving into the idea of the forest. We have been engaging with this primeval and archaic landscape entity of the forest for both confrontation and immersion with the landscape, as well as an examination of its layers of location, topography, soil, and vegetation. While we use many methods of engaging with the forest, the most rigorous is through drawing in many ways. The first is that of recollecting experience, of its depth and impenetrability, of its light and volumes, of its unfathomable abundance at all scales, and expanding it to enter the forest through the drawing. Then we start the unpeeling of all the layers and the juxtaposition of the two, of what you felt and remember and what it is made of. We also look at how these points in space are connected to larger systems. But no preparation is enough when you walk into the actual forest. It engulfs you, weighs you in, opens things up and awakens you. Then you need to restart the process for making sense of it all. Reading and recording the site, its experiences, and breaking down the components, drawing the site as is, reconstructing it to make sense of the many experiences, analyzing it to understand the larger processes at work and their extents, and eventually using it to reflect upon, with hopefully a greater level of awareness, this multidimensional spatial ecological entity and its space in human imagination. At the other end of the spectrum of things is the city. While it is relatively easier to find moments of revelation with respect to nature and its places in a forest or a jungle, is it possible to find the same in the proximity of urbanity? If yes, what are they and what will they tell us? Will they just reveal what must have been, or also tell us what can be? This is a question that we pose for ourselves as we set out to look at Ahmedabad. Again, this is part of a studio that I was engaged in last semester. And this time again, it began by literally wandering around from east to west, from north to south. And the city has expanded. So the extent that we looked at stretched from the Khari River to the east, in the east to Nal Sarovar in the west. While we know the landscape is one that belongs to the river and to the many small lakes, their characters vary, and there are many rivers and many lakes. And also there are places that hold water to different degrees. All these places are sometimes amplified by the layers of cultivation of that place, or sometimes they are erased. As we looked, we found remnants that told us of what was perhaps there earlier: the river, the wetland, and its varied inhabitants. But we also found places where the human agency had placed intersections to cultivate places of inhabitation. Some we all know, like the bunds to create large reservoirs, canals, and many others that we had not come across earlier. We found groves of trees along seasonal water streams and another river between the Sabarmati and the Nal Sarovar. This is the Rodh River. And digging into history, some of the snapshots that we found transported us to perhaps what can only be described as another place in another time. Stitching these together became crucial to see things as a whole, to understand what part fit where and when. To do this, we mapped all the natural features of the city: rivers, seasonal rivers, lakes, seasonal water bodies, low-lying areas that catch the water, direct it, apart from the canals, gardens, and some of the remnants of wilderness. This then became the basis for reconstructing, synthesizing, and imagining places that connected across scales and time. Some of these questions and methods also spill over to practice, and the attempt is to figure out what was and what can be there, wild, cultivated, abandoned, and designed, to create a palette to draw from. More often than not, it's the literal wandering around again that helps. At other times, it needs to be constructed from secondary sources. And to describe this further, I'm using two projects, one that is still on the boards and the other that was completed a few years ago. The first one is in Marathwada, located on an intriguing piece of land. This one we have worked on essentially through the lockdown and had to rely on secondary sources and of course all the tools available to us as landscape architects. The photographs we received showed clearly a small stream and reservoir within an undulating piece of land that had no large trees. Google Map immediately indicated a barren looking distinct entity within a large agricultural landscape. All these photographs and also talking to some other colleagues, one of them being a taxonomist, revealed that what we were looking at is probably a grassland with rocky terrain below. Thus, we had a very specific palette to work with: dense vegetation near the water, specific trees on the ridges, and the rest a range of grasses. The grassland is important because it is home to many species which cannot otherwise survive. The first design interventions have thus so far been about intensifying the existing and using it as a base palette to define and carve out places to occupy and enjoy the landscape without losing a sense of the vastness that is there. So while this project looks at intensifying the existing experience of the land, the next one takes what seems like an opposite approach. This second project is in Sangamner, about 30 minutes southwest of Shirdi. The project is essentially a garden around 3,500 square meters in area. And one of the first things that I felt there was needed to be done was understand what that place is. Also in terms of what could possibly start growing there. Rainfall again in this part of Maharashtra is very erratic. It ranges from 300 mm to 600 mm annually. The larger landscape around the site consisted of sugarcane fields all around, punctuated with very few pomegranate orchards. But some wandering around revealed other nuances of the context. Though scattered far and in between, there were thick rows of trees, a range of smaller cultivated mosaics of marigold, chrysanthemum, roses, tuberoses, and also many farm ponds. A botanical garden offered further clues. It contained ferns, amaryllis, and many other plants that were growing really well. Finally, it all began to tie up that this is an alluvial landscape that through the act of cultivation offered a bounty of agriculture and horticultural delights. The land has the capacity to produce a wide range of plants through human effort, a range of flowers, vegetables, fruits, trees, in fact everything needed to live and enjoy life. This became the starting point for the design of the landscape of the house. And apart from the usual requirements of a large lawn, thanks to the scale of the project, we could create a few different vignettes that included a large area dedicated to produce edible and sensual pods, roses, mogra, citrus fruit, and many other fruit, and other areas that allowed a more intimate engagement with nature for the inhabitants of the house. For me personally, the process for this particular garden helped clarify the relationship between the land, what occurs there naturally, and a richer, more delightful way of inhabiting that the act of cultivation allows.